I never imagined that a lie about an impossible betrayal would destroy my marriage, cost me my unborn child, and then come back nearly 10 years later to threaten the life I had rebuilt from nothing. My name is Elena Brooks, and for a long time, I believed that love alone was enough to survive anything, but I learned the hard way that love means nothing when trust is gone. When I was 24 years old, I moved across the country with my best friend, chasing independence and the kind of life we had always dreamed about. But within 6 months, she was gone again, offered her dream job back home, and I was left behind in a city that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, and completely unfamiliar. And that loneliness is exactly what led me to Adrienne Cole. Adrienne came into my life at the exact moment I felt most vulnerable. And at first, it felt like fate. Like everything I had lost by staying in that city was being replaced by something better. Because he was charming, attentive, and so certain about me that it made me feel safe in a way I hadn't felt since leaving home. He had just ended a long relationship, and I was still trying to find my footing in a new world. And somehow those two broken pieces fit together perfectly. At least that's what I believed back then. Within weeks, he was staying at my apartment more than his own place, and I convinced myself that the speed of our relationship wasn't a red flag but proof that what we had was real. Looking back now, I can see every warning sign clearly, but at the time, I ignored them all, especially when it came to Vanessa Hale. She was Adrienne's ex, but not in the way most people understand that word, because she wasn't really gone from his life at all. She was everywhere, at every family gathering, every celebration, every moment that should have belonged to us. And I told myself it was normal because their families were close, because they had grown up together, because love doesn't always end cleanly. I remember the first time I met her at his graduation, standing there beside his mother like she still belonged in his future, and I smiled, introduced myself, and tried so hard to be accepted, even when I could feel that I wasn't. Vanessa had this way of inserting herself into everything without ever appearing overtly hostile, clinging to his arm just a second too long, calling him old nicknames that made me feel like an outsider in my own relationship. And every time I brought it up, Adrienne would brush it off, saying, "She's just part of my life. Elena, it's complicated." And I believed him because I wanted to believe him. 8 months into our relationship, he proposed without a ring, without planning, without hesitation, and instead of questioning it, I said yes immediately, because I thought love was supposed to feel urgent, overwhelming, undeniable. But I didn't know then that he had chosen that exact day because Vanessa had just started dating someone else. Our wedding should have been the happiest day of my life, and in some ways it was, because my family flew in, and for a moment, everything felt whole again. But even then, the cracks were there, impossible to ignore if I had only been willing to see them. Vanessa wore white to my wedding, smiled as if she had every right to be there, and danced with my husband more than I did. And I told myself it didn't matter because I trusted him, because I believed in us, because I didn't want to be the kind of woman who felt threatened by another. That became a pattern in my life, ignoring the discomfort, excusing the behavior, convincing myself that love required patience and sacrifice, even when it started to feel like I was the only one making them. For 2 years, I built my entire world around Adrienne, around his family, around a life that slowly erased my own identity. And by the time I realized how isolated I had become, it felt too late to change anything. My friends were his friends, my routines revolved around his schedule, and every connection I had in that city was tied to him in some way. And I didn't notice how much power that gave him over my life until everything began to fall apart. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought it would bring us closer, that it would finally give us something that was just ours. Something untouched by Vanessa or his family or the constant tension that had been quietly growing between us. Instead, it destroyed everything in a single moment because when I told him, expecting joy, expecting excitement, expecting the future we had talked about so many times, he just looked at me with a coldness I had never seen before and said, "She told me this would happen." And in that moment, I knew that whatever Vanessa had planted in his mind had already taken root far deeper than I ever imagined. He didn't celebrate. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even hesitate. He just walked out that night, leaving me alone with the truth I couldn't yet understand. And when he came back the next morning, the man I loved was already gone, replaced by someone who looked at me like a stranger and gave me a choice that would change my life forever, saying, "Either you get rid of it or we're done." I remember staring at him, trying to process how the man who once promised me a future filled with children could now look at me like I was carrying something shameful, something that didn't belong to him. And when I asked him what he meant, he finally said the words that shattered everything. "Vanessa told me the baby isn't mine. She said you've been seeing Liam." For a second, I couldn't even react because the accusation was so absurd, so completely detached from reality, that my mind refused to accept it. But then it hit me all at once. The betrayal, the insult, the sheer impossibility of what he was accusing me of. And I felt something inside me break. Liam Carter was my stepbrother, someone I had grown up with, someone who felt more like a twin than anything else. And the idea that I would ever cross that line wasn't just wrong, it was deeply offensive. Yet Adrienne stood there, completely convinced, as if the lie had become his truth. I tried everything to make him understand. explaining calmly at first, then desperately, telling him that Vanessa was manipulating him, that she had always been trying to stay in his life, that this was just another way to pull him back, but he wouldn't listen. He kept repeating the same things. She wouldn't lie about something like this. Elena, she's known me my whole life, and that was when I realized the real problem wasn't the accusation itself. It was the fact that he trusted her more than he trusted me. I offered to take a paternity test immediately. I showed him medical records proving that I was already pregnant before my trip home. I even begged him to come with me to the doctor so he could hear it from a professional. But none of it mattered, because once doubt had taken hold of him, nothing I said could undo it. The worst part wasn't even his refusal to believe me. It was how easily he discarded me, how quickly he reduced our entire marriage to a single ultimatum, as if I was nothing more than a problem he needed to solve. And I remember asking him, my voice shaking, after everything, "You really think I would do that to you?" And he didn't hesitate when he answered, "I don't know what to believe anymore." And somehow that hurt even more than if he had outright said yes, because it meant that in his eyes, I was capable of it, capable of betraying him in the worst possible way, and no amount of truth could compete with the story Vanessa had built in his mind. That night, I cried harder than I ever had before, not just because my marriage was falling apart, but because I realized I had been fighting for something that might never have truly existed. And by the morning, I knew what I had to do. I packed my things slowly, methodically, trying to hold on to some sense of control while everything around me collapsed. And when Adrian saw the suitcase, he didn't try to stop me, he didn't apologize, he didn't even ask me to stay. He just watched in silence, as if my leaving confirmed everything he already believed about me. I told him one last time, "This is your child, Adrian, and one day you're going to regret this." But he just turned away, unwilling to face the possibility that he might be wrong. Going back home was the hardest and easiest decision I ever made at the same time, because while it meant leaving behind the life I had built, it also meant returning to the only place where I still felt safe, where I was surrounded by people who knew me, who trusted me, who didn't need proof of my character. My family didn't question me, they didn't doubt me, they just welcomed me back and helped me pick up the pieces. And for the first time in a long time, I realized how much I had lost by trying so hard to fit into a life that was never truly mine. The divorce itself was almost anticlimactic, quick and clean, thanks to a prenuptial agreement that his mother had insisted on, and Adrian didn't fight for anything. Not even for the child he was so certain wasn't his. He signed away his rights without hesitation, as if erasing us from his life was the easiest thing in the world. I thought that was the end of it, that whatever we had shared was now just a painful memory I could eventually move past. But life had one more blow waiting for me, one that would change everything in a way I wasn't prepared for. The stress, the heartbreak, the constant emotional strain of losing my marriage and starting over. It all became too much, and a few months after I returned home, I lost the baby. There are no words to fully describe what that felt like, because it wasn't just grief, it was anger, it was emptiness, it was the crushing realization that the child I had fought so hard to protect was gone. And the man who should have been there, who should have supported me, who should have loved that child unconditionally, had abandoned us long before I ever had the chance to hold them. For a long time, I blamed myself, wondering if I could have done something differently, if I could have handled the situation better, if there was any way to change the outcome. But eventually, I understood that some losses aren't caused by a single moment. They're the result of everything that came before. All the cracks I ignored, all the compromises I made, all the times I chose silence over confrontation. And so, I made a decision, not just to move on, but to rebuild my life in a way that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or validation, and over time. That decision led me to Daniel Brooks, a man who showed me what real love looked like. Steady, respectful, and grounded in trust, something I had never truly experienced before. By the time nearly 10 years had passed, I had convinced myself that Adrian Cole was nothing more than a chapter in my life that had already ended, a mistake I had learned from, a memory that no longer had the power to hurt me. But I was wrong, because some stories don't stay buried, and when they come back, they don't just reopen old wounds, they threaten everything you've built since. When I first heard that Adrian had been asking about me again after nearly a decade of complete silence, it felt like the ground beneath my feet shifted in a way I couldn't quite explain, because I had spent years convincing myself that part of my life was over, sealed away, untouchable, and suddenly it was being dragged back into the present without my permission. The news came from an old mutual friend who reached out hesitantly, as if unsure whether she should even be the one to tell me. And then she said, "He's been looking for you, Elena. He wants to meet you and your child." My chest tightened in a way that immediately brought back memories I had worked so hard to forget. It wasn't just the idea of seeing him again, it was everything that came with it. The lies, the betrayal, the pain, and the fear that somehow he still had the power to disrupt the life I had carefully rebuilt. At that point, my life was nothing like it had been before, because Daniel had become my safe place, my partner in every sense of the word. And together we had created a home that felt stable and real in a way my previous marriage never had. He knew I had been married before, but I had never told him the full story. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't want to relive it. Didn't want to give those memories more space than they deserved. And for years, that decision felt justified. Until now. Because now, Adrian wasn't just a memory. He was actively trying to re-enter my life, and I knew I couldn't face that without being honest with Daniel about everything that had happened. Before I could even gather the courage to have that conversation, the first follow request appeared on my social media, then another and another, until every platform I had was flooded with notifications from accounts bearing Adrian's name. I didn't accept any of them, hoping that ignoring him would be enough, that he would eventually give up and move on. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple, not after everything I had been told. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop even further. He had viewed my professional profile online, which meant he wasn't just casually searching, he was deliberately tracking me, piecing together my life from whatever fragments he could find. That night, I sat down with Daniel and told him everything, not the simplified version I had shared before, but the full story, every painful detail, every moment of doubt, every lie that had been used against me, and I expected him to react with anger or frustration that I had kept this from him for so long. But instead, he listened quietly, his focus entirely on me, and when I finished, he simply reached for my hand and said, "You don't have to go through this alone." And in that moment, I realized just how different this love was from the one I had lost. There was no judgment, no suspicion, just support, and that gave me the strength to face what was coming next. We decided together to block every account Adrian used to try to contact me, hoping that cutting off his access would discourage him, but it had the opposite effect. Because within days, new accounts started appearing, each one sending longer, more insistent messages than the last. At first, they were almost apologetic. I made a mistake. Elena, I need to see my son. But as I continued to ignore them, the tone shifted, becoming more demanding, more desperate. He deserves to know his real father. You can't keep him from me. And then, more unsettlingly, you can't block me forever. I will find a way. Reading those messages felt like stepping back into a nightmare I thought I had escaped, because they showed me that Adrian hadn't changed as much as he claimed. He still believed he was entitled to something he had given up years ago. Daniel tried to reassure me, telling me that we were safe, that Adrian was just grasping at something he had lost. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that ignoring him wasn't going to make him disappear. It was only going to push him to try harder. And unfortunately, that instinct turned out to be right, because a few days later, everything escalated in a way I never expected. I went to visit my mother one Saturday morning, just like I always did, a routine that had remained unchanged for years, a small piece of stability in my life. And for once, Noah wasn't with me. He had spent the night at a friend's house. So I went alone, thinking it would be a quiet visit like any other. I didn't notice the car parked across the street at first. Didn't think anything of it as I pulled into the driveway and stepped out. But then the door of that car opened and a man stepped out, walking toward me with a familiarity that made my heart stop before my mind could even process what was happening. It was Adrian, standing there as if no time had passed, as if the years between us meant nothing, and for a brief moment, I was frozen, caught between shock and fear, because seeing him in person after so long felt unreal, like a ghost from a life I had buried. But the fear quickly turned into something else. Something hotter, sharper, because the audacity of him being there, at my mother's house of all places, was too much to ignore. The first thing he said was almost absurd in its simplicity. "I've been trying to reach you," as if that explained everything, as if showing up uninvited was somehow justified. And when I demanded to know why he was there, he didn't hesitate, repeating the same thing he had been saying in his messages. "I want to see my son." Hearing those words out loud, standing face to face with the man who had once rejected that very child, was enough to push me past any lingering fear. And in that moment, all that was left was anger. Because I realized that he still didn't understand what he had done, what he had lost, and what he no longer had any right to claim. Something inside me snapped the moment he said those words, and all the fear I had felt just seconds earlier disappeared, replaced by a surge of anger so overwhelming that I didn't even recognize my own voice as I started shouting at him, throwing every truth he had ignored back in his face, reminding him of the night he walked out, the ultimatum he gave me, the way he signed away his rights without hesitation, and how he chose to believe a lie over the woman he had promised to trust. He tried to interrupt me at first, raising his hand slightly as if to calm me down, saying, "Elena, please, you don't understand." I didn't know, but I didn't let him finish, because I had spent too many years being silenced by his doubts, and I wasn't about to do that again. He kept repeating that Vanessa had manipulated him, that he had been confused and vulnerable, that he thought he was protecting himself from betrayal. And when I laughed, it wasn't out of humor, it was disbelief. Because even now, he was trying to shift the blame away from himself, as if he had been nothing more than a victim in his own choices. Then he told me what had changed, that Vanessa had confessed recently, that she admitted everything had been a lie, and that the moment he realized the truth, he started looking for me, determined to make things right, as if 10 years of silence could be erased by a single apology. But the thing he didn't understand, the thing he had never understood, was that some damage can't be undone, no matter how much time has passed. When he said, "I deserve to know my son," that was when I finally gave him the truth he had spent all these years chasing. And I didn't soften it. I didn't ease him into it, because he had never shown me that kind of consideration. I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "You don't have a son." Adrian, and for the first time since he arrived. He looked genuinely confused, like the script he had been following in his head had suddenly been rewritten without his consent. I could see the moment the realization started to form, and I didn't give him time to interrupt. I continued, telling him everything, how I lost the baby just months after the divorce, how the stress, the heartbreak, and the complete collapse of my life had taken everything from me, including the child he now claimed to want. He tried to speak, his voice unsteady now, asking, "What do you mean?" You lost it, but I didn't let him redirect the conversation, because this wasn't about his confusion. It was about the consequences of his actions, and I wanted him to feel every part of that truth. I told him that the only child in my life now was Noah, Daniel's son, my stepson, who I had chosen to love and raise as my own, and that being his mother had nothing to do with biology, something he clearly never understood. I said, "You were right about one thing. Adrian, I don't see family the way you do, because to me, love makes a family, not blood. And Noah is my son in every way that matters, but he's not yours, and he never will be." By then, my voice had drawn attention, and I could hear the front door opening behind me, my mother and stepfather stepping outside, along with a few curious neighbors who had no doubt been watching the entire scene unfold. But I didn't care, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to protect his image or avoid conflict. I was simply telling the truth. Adrian looked around briefly, as if suddenly aware of the audience, and for a moment, I thought he might argue, might try to convince me to let him explain further. But instead, he just stood there, silent, his expression shifting from shock to something I couldn't quite identify. Maybe regret, maybe disbelief, maybe both. My stepfather stepped forward then, his tone calm but firm as he said, "It's best if you leave." And Adrian didn't argue, didn't protest. He just nodded slightly and walked back to his car, leaving as abruptly as he had arrived. And as I watched him drive away, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, not closure, but a lingering unease that I couldn't shake. Because as much as I wanted to believe that telling him the truth would be enough to end this, a part of me knew that it wouldn't be that simple, not after everything he had already done to find me. For a few days, things were quiet again, almost eerily so, and I tried to convince myself that it was over, that he had finally accepted reality and returned to his own life. But then I started noticing small things that made my stomach tighten with dread. The same car parked down the street for just a little too long, a glimpse of a familiar figure in the distance that disappeared the moment I looked directly at it. And at first, I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. But when I mentioned it to Daniel, he didn't dismiss it. He started paying attention too, and it didn't take long before we both realized that this wasn't paranoia. Adrian was still there, still watching, still refusing to let go of something that no longer existed, and with each passing day, the situation became harder to ignore, until finally, we knew we couldn't handle it on our own anymore. The moment Daniel and I accepted that what was happening wasn't just coincidence but a pattern, we went to the police with everything we had. The photos of Adrian's car parked near our house, near my mother's street, the times we had seen him lingering just long enough to make his presence known before disappearing again. And I truly believed that would be enough, that someone would take it seriously, that they would understand how quickly this situation could escalate. But instead, we were met with polite skepticism, with explanations about lack of evidence, about how simply being nearby wasn't a crime. And I remember sitting there feeling both frustrated and helpless as they told us there was nothing they could do unless he actually acted on whatever intentions he might have. So we went home, knowing we were on our own, knowing that whatever Adrian was planning, we would have to be the ones to stop it. And that realization changed everything, because it meant we had to think ahead, anticipate his next move, and protect Noah at all costs. We started by informing his school, sitting down with the staff, and explaining the situation in detail, making it clear that under no circumstance was Noah to be released to anyone except Daniel, myself, or a trusted neighbor who worked there. And although it felt extreme at the time, something in my gut told me it was necessary, that Adrian wasn't going to give up just because I had told him the truth. For a few days, nothing happened, and that silence became its own kind of tension, like the calm before something inevitable. And then, exactly as we feared, it happened. In the middle of the school day, Adrian walked into the office as if he belonged there, calm, composed, carrying himself with a confidence that might have convinced anyone who didn't know the situation. And he told them he was there to pick up Noah because of a family emergency, even using my mother's name to make the story more believable. The staff followed the instructions we had given them, telling him they needed to call me first. And that was when his story started to crack, because he insisted that I was unavailable, that I couldn't be reached, that they should just trust him. When that didn't work, he pretended to step outside to call me himself, but instead of making any call, he went back to his car and waited. And that was his mistake, because the school had already contacted me, and by the time classes ended, everything was in place. Noah was kept safely inside with our neighbor, while the rest of the students were dismissed as usual, and Adrian sat in his car, watching, waiting for the moment he thought he could take what he believed was his. But instead of Noah walking out to him, the police arrived, and this time, they had everything they needed, because the school had recorded the entire interaction, every word he said, every lie he told, every attempt to manipulate the situation. I wasn't there when they arrested him, but I saw the footage later, and even watching it on a screen made my hands shake, because it forced me to confront just how far he had been willing to go, not just to see a child, but to take him. Inside his car, they found 2 plane tickets back to his home state, along with medication strong enough to sedate an adult, and the thought of what could have happened if we hadn't taken precautions, if the school hadn't followed protocol, if even one small detail had gone differently, was enough to make me feel physically sick. This wasn't about closure or regret anymore. It was something far more dangerous, something that could have changed our lives in a way we might never have recovered from. The charges against him were serious: conspiracy to commit kidnapping, endangering a minor, and others that were added as the investigation continued. And for the first time since this all began, I felt something close to relief, because it meant he couldn't reach us anymore, couldn't watch us, couldn't try again. Months passed between the arrest and the trial, and during that time, we did everything we could to return to some sense of normalcy. But it wasn't easy. Because once you realize how vulnerable you can be, that feeling doesn't just disappear overnight. When the trial finally began, I had to face him again, sitting across the courtroom from the man who had once been my entire world and was now responsible for one of the darkest chapters of my life. And yet, seeing him there, stripped of the confidence he once carried, didn't bring me satisfaction. It just reinforced how pointless it all had been. A paternity test was conducted as part of the case, confirming what I had told him from the beginning, that Noah was not his child, and my medical records were presented, proving that I had lost the baby all those years ago. And listening to those facts being stated so clinically, so detached from the emotions behind them, felt surreal, like my life had been reduced to evidence in a case file. Adrian tried to defend himself, claiming the medication was prescribed, that he had no intention of harming anyone. But the combination of everything, the lies, the planning, the persistence, painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. And in the end, he was found guilty and sentenced to several years in prison. As I walked out of that courtroom with Daniel by my side, I finally felt something I had been chasing for years. Not revenge, not victory, but closure. The kind that comes not from forgetting the past, but from knowing it no longer has the power to control your future. In the months that followed the trial, life slowly began to settle into something that felt normal again, or at least as normal as it could be after everything we had been through. And while I would have preferred to never hear Adrian's name again, the reality was that his shadow still lingered in ways I couldn't completely avoid. He was in prison, serving his sentence, and we had restraining orders in place to ensure that even after his release, he would never be allowed near Noah, our home, or his school. And that knowledge gave me a sense of security I hadn't felt since the moment he first reappeared in my life. Still, healing isn't something that happens all at once, and there were days when the memories came back stronger than I expected, moments where I would catch myself replaying everything, wondering how things could have been so different if he had just trusted me from the beginning. What I didn't expect was for Vanessa to resurface as well, because in a strange way, she had always been at the center of everything, the quiet force behind the chaos that had unraveled my life years ago. And now, she was back, not in person, but through a message that appeared in my inbox one evening, like a final echo of the past refusing to stay buried. I stared at her name for a long time before opening it, unsure of what she could possibly have to say after everything that had happened. But curiosity got the better of me, and when I finally read her words, I felt a mix of disbelief and bitter amusement. The message was exactly what I should have expected, full of insults, twisted justifications, and a strange sense of pride, as if she believed she had somehow won because Adrian was now back in her life. Even if that life existed behind prison walls, she mocked me, tried to diminish everything I had built, and implied that, in the end, she had always been the one he truly wanted, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it completely, choosing silence over engagement the way I had learned to do over the years. But then I realized something, that silence had been part of what allowed her to manipulate everything in the first place, that by never confronting her directly, I had given her space to control the narrative in ways I couldn't even see at the time. So I replied, not with anger, not with insults, but with a calm clarity that I knew would unsettle her far more than any emotional reaction ever could, telling her that if winning meant ending up with a man who had destroyed his own life chasing a lie she created, then she was welcome to it, and that I had no interest in competing for something I had already outgrown. I didn't wait for a response. I blocked her immediately after sending the message, and as I closed that chapter for what I hoped would be the last time, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, not because I had gotten the last word, but because I had finally stopped letting her influence how I felt about my own story. Later, I learned through distant connections that her own life was unraveling as well, that her husband had left her after publicly confronting her behavior, that the image she had tried so hard to maintain was falling apart piece by piece. And while part of me might have once found a sense of justice in that, I realized that it didn't matter anymore, because her consequences had nothing to do with me, just like her lies should never have had anything to do with me in the first place. The truth was, both of them had been trapped in a cycle of manipulation and denial for years, and the outcome they ended up with was simply the result of the choices they made. The final piece of news I received about Adrian was perhaps the most surreal, because even after everything, I hadn't thought much about what his life in prison would actually be like, but apparently, the kind of crime he had committed didn't sit well with the people around him, and I was told that he had been attacked, not fatally, but enough to send a clear message about how individuals like him were viewed in that environment. When I heard it, I didn't feel satisfaction. And I didn't feel sympathy either. I just felt a quiet confirmation that the world has its own way of balancing things out, even when it doesn't look the way we expect it to. Now, when I look at my life, at Daniel, at Noah, at the home we've built together, I don't see what I lost anymore. I see what I gained. The strength to walk away from something that was never truly right. The clarity to recognize manipulation when I see it. And the understanding that love without trust isn't love at all. It's just an illusion that eventually falls apart. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that the people who truly belong in your life will never make you question your worth, your truth, or your reality in the moment they do. It's already time to let them go. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever experienced betrayal, doubt, or the strength it takes to start over, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and tell me your thoughts in the comments below, because sometimes the stories we share are the ones that remind us we're not alone.